ISO functions to control your camera's sensitivity to light, and it gets more complex than that. In fact, it gets really complex. This video is for both beginning and advanced photographers, so I'm going to start out with the beginning content and then work my way up to the advanced stuff. If you're a beginner and you're feeling over your head, don't sweat it. Just hit stop, go take pictures. You don't actually have to sweat ISO that much. In fact, for you beginners, I'm going to tell you, just put your camera in auto ISO mode and don't worry about it, because auto ISO does a great job and will work for almost every situation. If you're not sure how to configure auto ISO or manually change your ISO, you can check out our tutorials at sdp.io/tutorial. And we probably have a detailed tutorial there specifically for your camera. You stuck with me? Good. Let's do a quick demonstration of how ISO works. Right now, Justin's filming with the camera in manual mode with manual ISO. The ISO is at ISO 400, and you can see the exposure looks pretty good. But let's change that ISO down to ISO 100. What you'll see is the camera keeps gathering the same light because it has the same shutter speed, it has the same aperture, but the ISO is lower, so the brightness of the image goes down. Now, Justin, raise it back up to 400. This is where we started. Now go 2 more stops north of that to ISO 1600. Again, the camera's locked into manual mode. We're changing only the ISO. What you see is the image is now overexposed. It's actually too bright. ISO controls the brightness of the image, but not necessarily how much light the camera actually gathers. So how do you know what ISO you need for a given situation? Well, if you're not sure, just use auto ISO as I recommended earlier. The camera's auto exposure system is pretty good about figuring out the ISO, especially if you shoot RAW. You can go back and make changes to the brightness of the image later. I almost always use auto ISO. There are just a couple of exceptions for me. If I'm doing night photography, I find the metering systems in all cameras just work pretty lousy at night. So I always dial in all manual settings during night photography. The lights in my studio don't communicate with my camera's auto exposure system, so then I have to use manual ISO. Pretty much any other time I use auto ISO. If you want to know how to control all your camera settings, watch our video titled How to Use Manual Mode. Now let's do a different demonstration where we show how ISO relates to the amount of noise in your picture. Justin's once again at ISO 400, but this time he has the camera in aperture priority mode. At low ISOs, ISO 400, ISO 200, ISO 100, your images are going to be quite clean. They will never be perfect. A lot of people will tell you there is no noise at low ISOs, but that's just not true. Zoom all the way in on an area of clear blue sky, or really any primary color, but especially reds and blues, and you'll definitely see noise, little speckles, little variations in brightness or color that just shouldn't be there. Let's jump up to ISO 6400 and see how it looks. Now, because the camera's in aperture priority mode, the camera's going to use a faster shutter speed to compensate for the fact that the higher ISO setting is adding a bunch of extra gain in there. And now look at the back of this monitor here. What you might notice are little speckles. That's digital noise, and that's the way it shows up in video, and it looks like that in still photos too, except it doesn't move around so much. ISO 6400 is noisy and your pictures look worse, but you often don't have any choice about it. If you want to shoot your kid's indoor soccer game or indoor basketball game or any indoor sport, you're probably going to be shooting at around ISO 6400 or maybe even higher, depending on how well lit it is. And you need a fast shutter speed. So what are you going to do? You just have to use a high ISO and you get lots of noise. And we'll talk a little bit later how to kind of overcome that. But let's go even higher. Let's go up to ISO 25600. And here the noise will start to get really obvious and kind of distracting. Now, a lot of people have some sort of rule where they won't shoot above a certain ISO because the images to them just become useless. A lot of people won't shoot over ISO 6400 because above that, they might as well not even take the picture. There's so much noise. How much noise you can tolerate is totally subjective. I don't mind pictures taken in high ISO, and I'd rather have a really high ISO and noisy picture than not have any picture at all. And especially if you're sharing your pictures on Instagram or other places where the format is really small, nobody's really going to complain. After all, it's more important that you capture the moment. Dynamic range is how much detail the camera can capture in the highlights and all the way down into the darkest shadows. And ISO does impact that. Higher ISOs tend to have less dynamic range than lower ISOs, but it depends on your camera. Check out the video that I have all about dynamic range for more information about that. And now we'll talk a little bit about extended ISO, a really common question about ISO. Almost all cameras have native ISOs and then extended ISOs. For example, on most DSLRs, the lowest native ISO they have is ISO 100, but then they'll offer an extended ISO of ISO 50. So what's the difference? Well, if you're shooting JPEGs, there really doesn't have to be any difference. You can just use those extended ISOs on the low end and the high end, and it's fine. And I almost always enable the extended ISOs on my camera, even though they might not be turned on by default. If you're shooting RAW, you'll find that shooting at a native ISO 100 and a native ISO of 50 with the same shutter speed and the same aperture will produce the exact same file, essentially. All you would have to do to simulate that ISO 50 picture is to take your ISO 100 picture and make it a stop darker. All your camera's doing when you enable a low extended ISO like ISO 50, your camera will overexpose your picture by a full stop and then adjust the brightness down. So you could just adjust the brightness down, overexpose your picture and adjust the brightness down in post, and you'd get exactly the same result. Because it's doing that, overexposing and then adjusting it down, it's cutting off a stop of dynamic range, and that's the downside to using extended ISOs. But it's fine. Whatever, it makes your preview easier, even if you're capturing the same data. At the high-end extended ISOs, like ISO 25600, that will underexpose your picture by a stop and then add that gain in afterwards, after the picture has been captured. It's kind of nice to know that, because some cameras don't have extended ISOs, or you wish they had an ISO extended even higher. Use that trick. Just shoot at the highest ISO and underexpose the shot, and then in post, raise that exposure up. We're getting really nerdy now, but let's talk about ISO invariance. See, ISO can be totally imaginary. It's not necessarily a physical process. It kind of depends on the camera. Often the difference between ISO 6400 and ISO 100 is just the amount of like digital amplification added in post. Just your camera will take a signal that it gets as a 10 and make it 100, and it just calls that a higher ISO. Let's look at an example in Adobe Lightroom. Up first, we have two pictures taken with the Nikon D810. If you look at the settings here, you can see that they're using the same settings, 1/40th f8. So they're gathering the same amount of total light. The only difference is the ISO here. And at this distance, the pictures look pretty much identical. Let's zoom in. And at this level, you can start to see the noise. And you can see the ISO 100 picture here has a little bit more noise than the ISO 6400 picture, but the difference is minor. Most people might not even notice this difference. It's kind of inconsequential. Well, here's the trick. Let me bring this picture into the develop module, and I'll show you the original picture here. Let me go back to what it looked like when I imported it. That's what it looked like when I imported it. It was underexposed by 6 stops. So all I had to do was to crank the exposure up here. Well, it only let me raise it up 5 stops there. So I had to use an adjustment brush and manually add that last extra stop of exposure. But that got me to 6 stops. And you can see from the original, what seems to be a completely black picture, I was able to recover almost all the data that I saw shooting at a native ISO 6400. So this is important. This helps to validate that thing that I said earlier, where you don't really need to sweat the ISO too much, especially if you're shooting RAW. If you miss it, as long as you aren't overexposing your picture, if you're underexposing your picture, you can pretty much recover it without any big penalty. Now, Nikon and Sony cameras show that ISO invariance, where it doesn't matter. Canon cameras and some other manufacturers don't really have that same ISO invariance, at least not to the same degree. I did that same test with the Canon 5DSR, and as we zoom in on the Canon sensor, you can see there really is a huge benefit to using the correct ISO. When we started at ISO 100 and pushed the exposure back up 6 stops in post, the end result was far, far noisier. So especially with Canon gear, it helps to nail it, but even so, if you're a stop or 2 off, it's probably not going to be a big deal. Now let's talk about ISO performance, because I know a lot of people are concerned about how their pictures will look at high ISOs when they buy the camera. Good news is it probably doesn't matter that much. It's probably one less thing to think about. It gets confusing because every time a new camera comes out, the camera manufacturer brags that it has a stop better performance or 2 stops better performance. And that might actually be true if you're a JPEG shooter. But if you care about image quality, you're probably already shooting RAW. And those claims just are never true when you're shooting RAW. According to our own testing and validated by third parties, ISO performance, high ISO performance doubles about every 8 years. And digital cameras haven't even been around all that long. So for ISO to performance to actually double, for there to be half as much noise at a given ISO, for ISO 6400 to look like ISO 3200 used to look like, it takes about 8 years. So if you want to cut that noise in half, you can just wait 8 years to buy another camera. Incrementally, year after year, ISO performance doesn't go up enough that you might even notice. There's also not a huge difference between different cameras. Even though, including us, we get really nitpicky about the ISO performance, generally the difference between 2 cameras of the same generation, of the same sensor size, is 15%, almost never more than 25%. These are pretty small differences. To put that in perspective, if you switch from an f5.6 lens to an f4 lens, you're gathering twice as much light. That's a full stop. That means instead of shooting at ISO 1600, you could shoot at ISO 800. You'd gather twice as much light. That would make way more of a difference than the biggest leap from the worst ISO performing camera with the same sensor size to the best ISO performing camera. Well, it's cheaper just to buy a faster lens. Another good way to make a jump in ISO performance is to jump up to a bigger sensor. At a given ISO, at ISO 400, at ISO 800, you're going to get about less than half as much noise on a full frame camera than you would on an APS-C camera. In other words, APS-C cameras will have about twice as much noise as a full frame camera at a given ISO. Now, to some extent, you can make up for that with faster lenses. Specifically, check out the Sigma 18-35 f1.8. It's a zoom lens and it's f1.8. And that means that you can use a lower ISO than you would be if you were using a full frame camera and an f2.8 lens. Okay, speaking of sensor size, let's talk about what ISO actually is. ISO defines a range of light that the sensor should be receiving. But when I say light, I'm talking about light intensity. So that kind of defines light per square unit of measure, like light per square millimeter, light per square inch. That will always be the same regardless of your sensor size. ISO 200 on a full frame camera and ISO 200 on an APS-C camera or a Micro Four Thirds camera are transferring the same light per square unit of area, the same light intensity. However, bigger sensors have more square inches, more square millimeters. Therefore, they're gathering more total light. And this is why I use the bucket in the rain metaphor. If you put out a small bucket in the rain and a large bucket in the rain, they're both gathering the same amount of rainfall per minute. And at the end of the day, you can look at it and they'll both have an inch of rain at the bottom of the bucket. But measure it in quarts or gallons, and the big bucket will have definitely gathered more water, right? And that's kind of the same way that sensors work. The larger sensor at the same ISO will gather more total light, and that explains why we see cleaner images with bigger sensors, because more light means cleaner images. I just told you that ISO defines the light intensity that's falling on a sensor. And in theory, you would think that ISO 200 would be the same amount of light intensity for any camera, but that's not really the case. First, the ISO standards actually define a kind of a flexible range. So they could have a little bit more or a little bit less light and still technically meet these standards. But manufacturers have been increasingly kind of stretching the truth with the ISO. See, manufacturers know that people tend to get a new camera and compare ISO 400 on that camera to ISO 400 on a different camera. And we just discussed that gathering more light creates cleaner images. So what do you think a manufacturer might do to make ISO 400 look better on their new camera? Well, they could underrate it. They could make ISO 400 actually ISO 320 or ISO 300. So in other words, your camera's metering system would meter for ISO 400 as if it were a lower ISO, forcing the camera to actually gather more light. And this happens all the time. All the manufacturers do this. Some stretch it more than others. Fuji in particular, it can be as much as like 2/3 of a stop. In other words, if you took a picture of the same scene with a Fuji and a Canon, the Fuji might decide to use ISO 400 and the Canon might decide to use ISO 250. And you might compare those pictures and see that they had about the same amount of noise, and you would say, gee, the Fuji's almost a full step ahead. Except the Fuji was actually using something more realistically like 250. It's just labeling it differently so that when you do those comparisons, it tends to look better. Those are not exact numbers, just it's approximate. And like I said, all manufacturers stretch ISO. But what you need to know is if you are going to do these types of comparisons, you can't just compare ISO 400 to ISO 400 because all cameras are a little bit different and they're all a little bit off. What you need to do is to shoot raw and set them to the same ISOs. But then once you get them into Lightroom or your post-processing app, equalize the exposures. Look at the histograms and adjust the exposure of each of the images until the histograms are exactly the same. At that point, you can do a fair comparison. Now let's talk about optimal image quality. Optimal image quality it's my own term for the amount of noise that you get when you have ideal lighting conditions. So if you're a landscape photographer, you're using a tripod, you'll always care about optimal image quality because that's going to control how much noise is visible in those big prints you make. Do you have a perfectly smooth sky, or is there noticeable noise in there? That all comes down to optimal image quality. If you're a studio shooter using studio lights, you'll always be shooting with all the light that you need, and therefore you'll be working at the base ISO with the optimal image quality. As somebody who does commercial and stock photography, and I have to go in and manually retouch the noise in any image, even at the base ISO, there's always always noise there, especially in the shadows. Optimal image quality is really important, and having a good optimal image quality just saves time because I don't have to do so much retouching. Some cameras have better optimal image quality than others, and if you're interested in it, I have a whole video on it. So check out that video for detailed information about how to figure out your camera's optimal image quality. And if you want to know how to get better optimal image quality than your camera can currently deliver, check out this other video about creating a perfect picture with any camera. Now let's talk about the history of ISO, and this does go somewhere kind of relevant. But back in the film days, we didn't label film with ISO, we labeled it with ASA speeds. So it was almost exactly the same. If you were going to be shooting outdoors in full sun, you would go buy some ASA 100 film, and that would be just like using ISO 100 on your camera now. If you were shooting indoors, you might use ASA 1600 film, which would be like shooting ISO 1600. So in 1974, the organization ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, they took over these standards. And instead of calling it ASA, photographers started calling it ISO. So the term ISO isn't referring to film speed. It's referring to the name of this organization that has lots and lots of different standards. One very small standard that they manage happens to be film speed, but us photographers have just kind of taken over their name to refer to this thing that is much smaller than the actual organization. And maybe to make matters worse, a lot of us have been mispronouncing it, saying ISO as if it were an acronym. And this is a totally understandable mistake because, for one, we came from ASA, which was the American Standards Association. It really was an acronym, and you might have just been in the habit of saying those three letters. But I talked to ISO, and I've done a lot of research into this. ISO is a three-letter word that for some reason the organization happens to capitalize. So it took over for another acronym. You might think it was an acronym, and it's written in capitals, and it happens to be three letters. But no, it's a three-letter word that they write in all caps, and nobody does that. It's very unusual. It looks like an acronym, but their name is the International Organization for Standardization. If it were an acronym, it would be IOS. And in fact, the root of their concern is that the acronym would be different in different languages. It might be something different in French or Spanish because, they wouldn't necessarily put the words in the same order. So they didn't want to use an acronym. This was a decision that they made like back in the 40s or 50s. So it's been standing for a long time. And I contacted ISO to try to figure out, why did you decide to write this in all caps? It's causing a lot of confusion with people. And they said, we don't know. But you look at the standards, the founding documents of the organization, and they just say the name is ISO, written in all caps, and we've been using that this whole time. But it is the name of an organization. And I get to determine how my name is pronounced, to pronounce it Tony. If somebody pronounces it some way different, well, that might be their version of Tony, but my name is still pronounced Tony. So ISO pronounces their name ISO, like I'm saying it. They don't spell out the letters ISO. Check out their official videos online.
But when ISO standards are applied,
and there's an ISO committee.
ISO standards help to make the world a safer.
Yep, that's an ISO standard too.
ISO can make a positive difference to all our lives. ISO standards help create growth.
And there's an ISO cosmetics committee.
ISO standard.
It's time to get up. Do you know the ISO International Time Standard?
Or you can give them a call at this phone number and hear it for yourself. I'll save you the time. They will say ISO. If you check out their foreign language videos, you'll actually hear them say ISO.
Grâce aux normes ISO, l'ISO améliore notre quotidien. Les normes ISO, l'ISO nous aide à relever. Les normes ISO touchent pratiquement tout ce que nous faisons.
So they do pronounce it differently in other languages, but they don't ever actually spell it out. Just a bit of trivia about the math behind ISO. A lot of people tell me ISO is a logarithmic scale. It's not. It's an arithmetic scale. It's just kind of linear. You go from ISO 100 to 200, the number doubles. The amount of noise doubles, and your shutter speed would be cut in half. There's nothing logarithmic about it. In fact, there is a separate logarithmic ISO scale, and in that scale, ISO 100 is referred to as 21 degrees. ISO 200 is defined as 24 degrees, each stop increasing 3 degrees, kind of like decibels. But the ISO scale that we use is actually linear. If you like this kind of geeky stuff, go to sdp.io/geek. I have a whole playlist there, which is filled with like intense, nerdy camera videos. I would also suggest you subscribe to our channel. We have lots of tutorials, nerdy and not, some fun, some entertaining, some educational. And check out our books. We have a whole series of books covering photographic techniques, using post-processing software like Lightroom and Photoshop, and buying camera gear. You can pick them all up directly from our store in either ebook or paperback format, starting at under $10, sdp.io/store, or just go to Amazon to check out reviews. Do me a favor, give me a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. That helps us out. Thanks so much.